Imagine having so much influence that you could completely rewrite someone's future with just a few strokes of a pen. That's exactly what happened when coal heiress Irene Moore Lyon made a shocking change to her will that would ripple through generations.
You know what's fascinating about this story? The way wealth and power intersected with such profound personal loss in Irene's life.
Speaking of loss, let's look at this remarkable pattern. By age 39, she had already lost her father, 2 husbands, and her mother. That's enough grief to fundamentally change anyone's perspective on trust and loyalty.
And yet we can barely find a trace of her existence. No photographs, just this incredibly detailed passport application from 1906.
That passport description is like a window into another time. 5'8", blue eyes, broad mouth, square chin. It's almost more intimate than a photograph would be, don't you think?
It really is. And what strikes me is how these physical descriptions were actually crucial for travel documentation back then. It's such a different world from our modern ID systems.
Well, let's talk about her first marriage to Hubert Wigmore. There's something almost poetic about how their paths crossed. Here's this military man mapping coal deposits in the Philippines, and he ends up marrying the daughter of coal fortune.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like their lives were destined to intersect through this connection to coal. But then tragedy strikes just 5 years into their marriage.
Right? And what makes it even more heartbreaking is that he died suddenly in Japan, at Lake Chuzenji, of all places, a peaceful summer retreat that became the site of such profound loss.
So what compels a woman who's experienced such loss to marry again? Because her second marriage to William Henry Smith Jr. was quite different, wasn't it?
Oh, dramatically different. She was 33, he was 58, a May-December romance that spoke more to stability than passion. They even bought this grand estate in Rockville, Maryland, almost as if they were trying to build the future they'd never get to have.
You know what's particularly interesting about that period? The way wealthy women had to navigate their social circles, especially when it came to medical care and confidential matters.
That's such a crucial point. Doctors were among the few men who could maintain both professional and social relationships with elite women without raising eyebrows, which makes Dr. James Alexander Lyon's entry into her life so fascinating.
And their marriage lasted 27 years, longer than her previous marriages combined. Yet something happened that made her essentially write him out of her will.
Well, let's consider the magnitude of that decision. She didn't just adjust her will, she completely removed a prominent physician, her husband, and replaced him with a bank as trustee. That's not a small change, that's a statement.
Do you think it could have been about protecting her legacy? After all, she'd seen so much loss in her life.
That's entirely possible. And we have to remember that this was a woman who grew up in 2 parallel worlds, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, where the coal money originated, and Washington, D.C., where status and reputation were everything.
Speaking of reputation, let's talk about how she managed her wealth through these careful, distant friendships that wealthy, unmarried women had to cultivate at the time.
You know what's remarkable about that? Her will became her voice. Every amendment, every clause, every insertion and removal became an emotional artifact of her final wishes.
And now, here we are, generations later, still trying to understand what drove those final decisions. What could have happened to make her remove Dr. Lyon so completely?
Well, there are several possibilities. Disappointment, betrayal, outside influence, fear of blending estates with outside families, or maybe even declining health, making her vulnerable to institutional advice.
That's what makes this story so compelling. It's not just about wealth and inheritance. It's about trust, loyalty, and the power dynamics that existed in these upper-class circles.
And let's not forget about the adopted daughter, Betsy, who was only lightly provided for in the will, while an orphaned grandchild was positioned to inherit everything. These decisions tell us so much about Irene's values and priorities.
It really shows how complicated family dynamics can become when there's significant wealth involved, doesn't it?
Absolutely fascinating how one woman's choices could create such ripples through time. And now here we are, looking back at these decisions that set off this chain reaction of events that would impact generations to come.
And speaking of impact, I'm particularly intrigued by how the courts eventually got involved. It really speaks to how contentious these matters can become.
Well, that's what happens when you have this perfect storm of wealth, power, and family dynamics. And in the end, Irene's story reminds us that sometimes the most telling parts of a person's legacy aren't in what they show us, but in what they choose to hide or change.
That's such a powerful observation, how the absence of information can tell us just as much as its presence.
Looking ahead to our next discussion about Dr. Lyon, I think we're going to uncover even more layers to this fascinating story of wealth, medicine, and marriage in the early 20th century.